So I'm going to start out with a memory from childhood. Do you all remember those origami fortune tellers that we made as kids? They kind of looked like this. And there were numbers on the outside, and then you'd pick a number, and then your friend would open up a flap, and then you'd maybe pick a color, and then your friend would open up another flap, and then they'd tell your fortune, right? Well, I loved making these as a kid, but more than making these, I loved stealing other people's fortune tellers. People got tired of them pretty quickly, so it was okay. But when I would have a veritable mountain of these, I would lock myself in my room, and I would open them all up so they looked kind of like this, and I would just stare at all the possibilities. I was kind of a precocious child. And I would sort of stare in awe at all the possibilities at once together, right? And I always thought, oh, wouldn't it be better if we didn't have to open just one flap? We could open all the flaps, right? That was more interesting to me as a child. Well, recently, I started thinking about the fortune teller as a great metaphor for our food lives, right? So let's say that our fortune tellers each represent an act of eating. Let's say we have a fortune teller that represents cracking an egg for breakfast, right? Now, when most of us crack an egg for breakfast, we see an egg, and we think, oh, this egg is going to be delicious if we cook it right, yeah? So we have that flap open on our fortune teller, right? Some of us may have this flap open, right? The egg came from a chicken. Most of us probably have that in our head somewhere. Most of us probably don't experience this flap on a regular basis. We used to, but not anymore. In Portland, Oregon, where backyard chickens are very popular, there are actually a lot of baby chickens running around in our lives. When I was in France, I cracked an egg for breakfast, and this is the flap that I experienced. Most of us don't experience that flap on a regular basis. My friends think I'm crazy for taking photos like this, but I think it's beautiful. Some of us may experience this flap open, right? And then there's this flap. We all know it exists, but most of us aren't going to experience that in our lifetime, right? Those doors are pretty well closed. That flap is closed. So in 2009, I felt like I was living my life with one flap open, my food life, my professional life, and honestly, my personal life. I was a magazine editor. I've been a magazine editor for about 10 years, and I've been doing what is often called service journalism, which means writing stories like 10 great ways to cook a steak, and 12 best restaurants, and 150 ways to apply mascara, that kind of story. Really one flap open journalism, right? And at the same time, I was a food writer, and I was getting to taste a lot of great food and bad food, and I was talking about how it tasted in my writing. But I wasn't really talking about where that egg came from, where that steak came from. I wasn't talking about who produced it, how it was produced. I wasn't even really thinking about it, even as a journalist. And then I lost my job. And like so many victims of the recession, I fretted, I worried about what I was going to do with my life. And then, unlike so many victims of the recession, I decide I'm going to become a butcher. Now, I don't exactly look the part of a butcher, which made it really hard to learn butchery, actually. But there were a couple of reasons why I decided to learn butchery. One was that I wanted just kind of an unmediated experience with food. And butchery, to me, was very unmediated, right? There were a couple of other things that informed my decision. One was that there was a statistic floating around that I often read, which was that 99% of the meat that we eat in America is factory farmed. And I had wondered, what does the 1% look like? No one's talking about the 1%. I know it means it's not a factory farmed, but what would acquiring that 1% of meat require of me? How would that change my life? And then, of course, because of investigative journalism, it's quite difficult to ignore the fact that those factory farms and the meat consumption that goes along with it is detrimental to our environment, to our health, to the health and well-being of the animals that grace our table, right? And so we've developed a couple of main responses to that. On the one end of the spectrum, we have staunch vegans. There's a lot of those where I come from in Portland, Oregon. On the other end of the spectrum, we have people eating factory farm meat, right? Whether it's because they care, they don't care, the problem's too big, they don't think they can afford to do anything else. I, myself, have actually been in all parts of that spectrum. I grew up hunting and fishing in rural Oregon. Then I became a vegetarian as a teenager. Then as a college student, I ate everything put in front of me, but I still called myself a vegetarian. And then as an adult, as a food writer, I was required to eat everything put in front of me for my job, right? So I wondered, what does the space between factory farm meat eating and veganism look like, right? We don't talk about that very often. So I decided to study butchery because I thought that could give me answers to these questions. And the answer that I've discovered comes in the form of one simple word: transparency. And I'm not talking about like breaking down the doors of factory farms or putting webcams in pig pens. It's a great idea, but I'm not into that. I'm talking about a form of transparency that where I live is nearly extinct, right? Where you guys live in Sitka, it's actually not. You have a lot of hunting and fishing going along. You have a lot of people killing their own dinner. That's the kind of transparency I'm talking about. So I set out to learn butchery. I don't look the part. No one wanted to teach me. There are no classes. There are no schools, except one woman named Kate Hill, who lived in Southwest France, did not flinch, did not bat an eye when I said I wanted to learn butchery. Kate Hill has been living in France for 2 decades, and she's made it pretty much her life's work to help people live their food lives with every flap open. So I moved to France. I lived here, not too shabby for an unemployed lady. And I ate food like this every day. This is not fancy food. This is peasant food. This is very simple food, and it came from farmers who produced food within an hour or 2 of where Kate lived. Which brings me to my first real big lesson in transparency. Eating food like this every day changes everything. So did studying with the Chapellards. The Chapellards were 4 brothers, 2 of their wives, who owned a business that got pork to people's tables. But it was a unique business in the sense that they owned every part of getting the pork to people's tables. So they grew the grain to feed the pigs they raised. They raised a couple of hundred pigs a year. They raised them humanely. They were allowed to be pigs. They roamed around. They ate a diet that pigs are supposed to eat. They owned a cooperative slaughterhouse with a couple of other small farmers, so they owned the slaughter part of the process. And they cut all the meat on the farm. They did all the butchery. They turned it into fresh cuts themselves. And then what didn't get turned into fresh cuts got turned into cured meats like sausage, bacon, ham, saucisson, which is their version of salami. This is where I spent a lot of my time. And then they sold all of the meat at a couple of outdoor markets a week. And when I say all of the meat, I mean all of it. Bones, skin, head, tail, feet, everything, fat. And I worked at these markets with them, and I was astonished at how different their clientele was from the meat buyers, and I was one of them, in Portland, Oregon, where I was from, and really most of America. Why? Because they knew how to cook every part of the animal. They weren't afraid of a pig head. They weren't afraid of a trotter or the feet, right? They valued every cut, and they thought that every cut should get the respect it deserved, and that it could all be delicious. They also valued those rich peasant preparations, right? Salt, putting salt on meat, hanging it, letting air dry it, and then you have these incredibly rich pieces of meat that you don't want to eat on a regular basis. It's not a 99% God-given right for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It's an accent. And so they ate less meat on average than we did in America. So I went to France just to learn butchery, and I got an education in that 1%. I got an education in what that 1% required of me personally, and I got an education in where I could stand on a spectrum if I didn't want to be a vegan and I didn't want to eat factory farm meat. And so I went to Portland and I said, well, if I'm going to do anything like the Chapellards, I'm first of all going to need 4 brothers and 2 wives, but I'm also going to need to create that kind of customer base. How am I going to do that? The answer, of course, is education, but the kind of education I had in mind was education with total transparency at its foundation, right? So I went to farmers who weren't factory farms. They represented that 1%. We do have those in Oregon, and in fact, I've learned those are everywhere. They're hiding, but they're everywhere. And I said, hey, would you sell some meat to some of my students? They said, well, yeah, but we only sell whole or half animals. You can't just buy a pork chop. And I said, perfect. And they said, and we don't deal with the slaughter and the butchery. You got to deal with that yourself. And I said, that's great. And so then I went to slaughterhouses, and I went and found guys with guns and trucks who do this on a regular basis, and I said, hey, would you let students come and watch you do this and learn how to do this? They said, sure. And then I found butchers. I found chefs who do whole animal butchery. I found old retired meat processors with all of this amazing knowledge in their head and no one to share it with, and I said, will you share this with us? And they said yes. And then I had to find students who wanted to learn all of this, who wanted to go home with all the meat at the end of the class. And weirdly, there were a lot of people in Portland, Oregon who wanted to take these classes. We launched our first pig butchery class in early 2010. 10 students, 300 pounds of pork, 1 instructor. and knives, and the students broke it all down themselves. That class sold out, the next class sold out, the next class sold out. We started doing lamb butchery, beef butchery. We taught people how to make sausage, how to make ham, how to make bacon. You can take a pig head class where we teach you how to take the face off and roll it up and eat it, which sounds gross, but it's really good. You can take a rabbit class where you learn how to kill a rabbit and skin it and eviscerate it and what to do with it, right? That's a very controversial class in Portland, Oregon. It is. You'll see why later. So the results of this have been really unexpected, delightfully unexpected, right? First and foremost, we offer our students a way to have their meat fortune tellers fully opened, right? We teach them the 99%, the 1%, how that meat gets to your table, and then they get to choose where they're going to be on that spectrum. Not in a reactionary way, but in a transparent, educated way. Many of our students start buying whole and half animals directly from our 1%er farmers, and that's all the meat they eat for the year. Many of our students claim that they save money on meat. Why? Because they're buying those whole and half animals directly from farmers. They're doing all the work themselves, and any of you who hunt and fish in the audience probably can relate to this. And they value what it means to kill their own dinner. They value the life that brought that meat to the table. And so they don't eat as much, right? It's a special occasion for them. If our students don't go on to do the slaughter and butchery themselves, they understand the skill it takes to do that, and so they're willing to pay a talented person to do that for them, right? Some of our students go on to work at meat counters. They may be meat counters that sell that 99% factory farm meat, but they have a 1%er in their midst now, right? Some of the people who work at meat counters come and take our classes. Why? Because most people who work at meat counters in America never see where that pork chop came from. They never see a whole animal. They don't know what part of the animal it came from, so they come to us for that experience, right? Some of our students become vegans and vegetarians. Awesome. But they're doing that, again, in a transparent, educated fashion, not as a reactionary fashion. Some vegans and vegetarians come and take our classes. They especially love our rabbit slaughter class. Wouldn't you know, right? So they come because they say, well, if I can do all of this myself, I might eat meat again, right? Some vegans and vegetarians and meat eaters really don't like us. Why? Because even though we, like them, don't like the idea of the 99% factory farm meat, there's still an elephant in the room, or a pig in the room, which is that in order to eat meat, you have to kill an animal for your dinner. No one wants to talk about that. It's a really hard subject for people. Some butchers and farmers don't like us. Why? Because our students ask lots of questions. How did you raise that pig? What did you feed it? What breed is it? Why does that pork loin look gray? That kind of stuff, right? High school students, grandmas, single moms, welders, merchant marines, artists, designers, doctors, architects, hunters, fishers, conservatives, liberals, everyone you can think of takes our classes. This is an education that an increasing number of people want, surprisingly, right? Now, there's also been some pretty unexpected results for me personally. I found myself in some very strange situations. For instance, posing with a pig head for the New York Times Magazine, right? Yeah. This was a story about a group of high schoolers that asked me to spend a week with them and teach them how meat got to their table, both the 99% and the 1%. And this pig that you see all cut up on the table, they met alive. We took them to the slaughterhouse. They watched the slaughter process. We took the carcass to a kitchen. I handed them boning knives. I taught them how to break it all down into their respective cuts. We made sausage. They went home, each with 30 or 40 pounds of meat, and they talked to their families about where all that meat came from. This photo made people incredibly angry. So angry. I got so much hate mail out of this photograph, right? Why? Because no one wants to know where that meat came from, right? You don't want to remember there's a pig head. I've also found myself posing in a little black dress with a very sharp knife. Another very bizarre turn of events in my life. Which brings me to a major strange lesson in transparency, which is that if you talk openly about killing animals for food, some people will call you a poet with an umlaut over the O. Which is crazy because I'm not a poet, right? But like a poet, I am willing to dedicate words to something that few people want to talk about, right? I found myself the subject of headlines like these: the rabbit wars, pets or meat, rabbits stolen before a butchering class, the farm direct meat revolution. Which brings me to another lesson in transparency, a hard one for me, which is that if you talk openly about killing animals for food, the media will most definitely want to hear your real story. It doesn't mean they're going to tell the real story in the end, right? Me coming from media, I somehow didn't know this. Okay, so I've also become the very lucky recipient of emails like these. Things you should do today: get cancer, rot slowly and painfully. Remember when I said those rabbit slaughter classes were a little controversial? So that brings me to another lesson in transparency, which is that if you talk openly about killing animals for food, people will most certainly not think you're a poet. They will often call you a psychopath, a murderer, or a sociopath. I also get emails like this. Hi there, I wanted to let you know that even though I'm a vegan, I wholeheartedly support what you stand for. It's obvious that your organization cares about the animals. So even though meat is murder, I guess you guys are the Dexters of murderers. I didn't know who Dexter was. This is Dexter. It's a TV show about a really nice guy that kills people. So that's what I am, I guess. I also get emails like these. I loved hearing your story. These are all in response to the story I wrote for This American Life about the rabbits that were stolen before a rabbit class. I loved hearing your story. I'm a 69-year-old child therapist, hunter, husband, father, grandfather, and former rabbit raiser, my favorite resume on earth. I was struck by your intelligence. If I lived in Portland, I would be signing up for your course. Just remember what the poet Blake said: tell the truth and a base man will avoid you. Which brings me to my next lesson in transparency. Poetry really does just tell the real story sometimes. Okay, so now that I've obviously convinced you I've started a meat revolution, let's just look at pure numbers here. If we assume that Portlanders, when I first started this, represented that 1% of meat, they ate that 1% of meat, if I take all the students that I've taught in the past 3 years and I project that into the future, it will take until 2019 for that 1% to go to 2%. In Sitka, it would only take me about 7 classes, I figured out. And you guys probably are way more, you're probably higher than the 1% because you have a lot of subsistence hunting and fishing, right? It's not the numbers that keep me doing what I'm doing, right? It's the power of a truly transparent experience. The art critic John Berger, he described these kinds of experiences as being indivisible and continuous. They refer backwards and forwards to one another. And the result of that kind of experience is intimacy. And in the case of what we do, intimacy with life and death. And if we're lucky, the result of that intimacy is meaning. And that meaning, I've learned, can take many forms. Be it vegetarianism, eating that 1%, killing your own dinner. But it's the kind of experience that we're not going to find if we live our lives with one flap open. Because let's be honest, folks, our food lives, our professional lives, our personal lives should be much more engaging than that. Thank you.